I'm Charlie Younkerman. I'm the co-chair of the program committee with Peter Stansky. One of the pleasures of my life. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon for what's certainly going to be an interesting and instructive, challenging, memorable program. Memorable in several senses, probably one that will bring back memories for many of you in the room. Thank you to Charlotte for all of her assistance in making this and each one of our events a success, so nicely organized. This event, as some of you know, grew out of a program that we did last year with President Richard Lyman when he spoke about his book on the occasion of the publication of his book, which is entitled Stanford in Turmoil, Campus Unrest, 1966 to 1972. And at that event, Lenny Siegel had a chance to, during the Q&A period, ask Dick some questions and enter into some dialogue with Dick about those years and about the anti-war movement. And not only he and I, but many other members of the society felt that there was much more to say, of course. And so with Lenny's agreement, we put together this program today. It's not intended to be a response to Dick. It's not intended to be a rebuttal. I'm not even sure that his book or his interpretation of the events of 1966 to 1972 will come up. It's a program that, of course, stands on its own. These were consequential years, not only for the university, but for the nation and for several countries in Southeast Asia. And they were certainly formative for anybody who was here at the university, faculty, staff, and I think especially students. So a program dedicated to the peace movement at Stanford is entirely justified. You call this the peace movement or the anti-war movement? The roots of the Stanford Peace Movement. Nice framing. So a few quick introductions, and then I'm going to turn it over to Lenny Siegel. Lenny is here, sitting on your left. He is now the executive director of the Center for Public Environmental Oversight, has been since 1994. He's one of the environmental movement's leading experts on both military facility contamination and the vapor intrusion pathway. And for his organization, he runs two internet news groups, the Military Environmental Forum and the Brownfields Internet Forum. He entered Stanford as a physics major in 1966, but was not allowed to register in the spring of 1969 as a result of his efforts, along with about 50 other students, to participate in a board of trustees meeting on campus. Jeanne Friedman, at the far end to your right, is a philanthropy consultant focused on peace and community development, regional arts, and conservation. She came to Stanford as a political science graduate student in 1963, and a year later joined an arms control project at the Hoover Institution. In response to the 1964 free speech movement, she helped found the Graduate Coordinating Committee, quote, to tell the truth about Berkeley, a mission that quickly expanded into anti-war mobilizing. Readmitted in 1965 as a doctoral student, she held a teaching assistantship, worked in the Free U, and helped form the A3M, April 3rd movement. Since 1969, she's worked with anti-war GIs and veterans, and today seeks justice and remediation for victims of Agent Orange in Vietnam, as well as in the United States. And in your middle, Georgia Kelly is the founder and director of Praxis Peace Institute in Sonoma. She's produced several conferences on peace-related themes, including the Economics of Peace, a 5-day meeting that took place in 2009. In the 1960s, she worked at Stanford Research Institute, and as a result of that work, became active in the Stanford anti-war movement and the Free University of Palo Alto. Upon leaving SRI, she returned to music and became a professional harpist, composer, and recording artist. 10 years ago, she founded Praxis Peace Institute, a peace education nonprofit organization, in order to continue the quest begun in the 1960s. So all three of the panelists clearly have had continuous trajectories from their involvement in the peace movement at Stanford in the late 60s. A fourth panelist, David Pugh, may show up, but I'm not going to introduce him. If he shows up, he can tell you who he is. He lives in San Francisco, and we hope he can make it. But if not, we've got three people who have a lot to say, and we're very glad that you've agreed to join us this afternoon.
I appreciate the opportunity for those people who were the unrest to tell our history. I'm hoping the discussion won't be so much about whether we were right or wrong, but more about why our movement emerged, why it became so strong, and why it lasted so long. And without further ado, I'll start with Jeanne. We're each going to speak for about 10 minutes and then hopefully open this up for discussion.
Thanks. Thank you. I got to start first because I'm the oldest. In the fall of 1963, Stanford was at a turning point. The farm was still idyllic. Outside of 2 wide crossing paths, the quad was packed dirt. Most of the campus was undeveloped. Computers were found only in a few buildings. The faculty was 98% male. Undergraduates were generally blonde and primarily from California. There were rumors of a freshman arriving on campus that year towing his horse trailer. But President Sterling's great leap was transforming the university into one with national scope and prominence. There was an influx of faculty lured from prestigious Eastern and Midwestern schools. For graduate students, I was later told, this meant over-admitting Easterners. Not only was I from New York City, I came from the City College, a school that rarely sent liberal arts graduates to Stanford. We Easterners were often dark-haired, making it easy to tell the difference between first-year graduate students and seniors. Unhappily for me, the great leap in political science meant a department that was increasingly behavioral in methodology. I saw it as without values, not the study of politics I had anticipated. I worked mostly with the old-timers and eventually completed my doctoral coursework and exams. But in 1963, even in the face of a presidential assassination, there was no real politics to study. And in the spring of '64, unsure about continuing in graduate school, I accepted a research position in arms control at the Hoover. That fall, 3 months after the manufactured Gulf of Tonkin incident and congressional resolution to escalate the war in Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson was elected president. The director of the Hoover Institution was a Goldwater campaign advisor. I wore a button that said "Part of the Way with LBJ." Locally, the free speech movement at Berkeley erupted. One FSM group, the Graduate Coordinating Committee, was especially interesting, and a few graduate students resolved to create a similar organization here. We couldn't think of a name, so I suggested we use the same one, the GCC. Our first leaflet was called "The Truth About Berkeley." As I recall, 4 of us put out that leaflet, 3 English department graduate students and me. Our core group was never more than 25 students, a group that included, by the way, both of Stanford's future poet laureates, Bob Haas and Robert Pinsky. There were no campus-wide organizations for graduate students. The GCC was it. We attracted students interested in local, national, and international politics and became a springboard for organizing, especially about the war. I now had a good reason to return to graduate school, to remain on a campus that was politically engaged and continue anti-war organizing. This was a 180-degree turnaround from 2 years earlier, and in the fall of '65, I was readmitted as a doctoral student and teaching assistant. From then until I left in June '69, there was a virtual explosion of campus organizing and activity among faculty, students, and staff. The war in Indochina was a constant call to action. Unlike the sharply curtailed war news of today, our daily news was graphic, with haunting images demanding a response. A young girl fleeing her own napalm flames, our South Vietnamese ally throwing prisoners from helicopters. The first campus teach-in took place on May 17, 1965. The Stanford Committee for Peace in Vietnam was formed. In January of '66, classes began at the Experiment and the Free University of Palo Alto. Later, they merged to become the Mid-Peninsula Free University. There was an alternative community newspaper, The Observer, and a chapter of Students for a Democratic Society. In 1966, reflecting widespread campus horror at atrocities in Vietnam, an anti-war undergraduate was elected ASSU president. A year later, he founded the Resistance, an anti-draft organization. Students and faculty worked on other issues as well. Supporters of the farm workers called for a grape boycott on campus and in the surrounding towns. Unionized campus staff raised their own issues. Teaching and research assistants formed a union. There had been a long civil rights presence on campus, from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to the Selma Montgomery March and Voting Rights Act of '65, to the formation of the Black Panther Party in Oakland in '66 and the Detroit and Newark riots in '67. Then there was 1968. Martin Luther King was assassinated, then Robert Kennedy. Undergraduates and graduate students gathered around televisions and wept together. The presidential election was completely focused on the war, overwhelmingly the central issue on this campus. The national slogan of SDS was "Bring the War Home." First, Stanford students and faculty questioned the university's connections to the war. Students documented how the university was complicit, proving the existence of classified research and its uses in the war. Information about research projects at the Stanford Research Institute was not readily available. There was no internet. The corporate board connections of the trustees to companies that parallel today's Blackwater were not a click away, nor what these corporations produced to what end, but the research was done. In the end, the research linked Stanford, both the university and SRI, directly and indirectly to the execution of the war. The response of the anti-war movement was to bring the matter of university complicity to the entire Stanford community, to determine whether such work should remain part of our university. Our tools were leafleting, debates, and endless rallies and meetings. Second, we brought the war home by disturbing the peace. In the face of a murderous and illegal war in Southeast Asia, we felt morally obliged to stop business as usual, to end university complicity in the war. For most of us, though not all, this meant nonviolent protest. Key issues electrified the campus: classified research, the once impenetrable work at SRI, chemical and biological warfare research in particular, and the connections between the trustees and the war. As our judgment led us to conclude that classified research had no place at Stanford, we were charged with being against academic freedom. In October 1967, SDS formally asked President Sterling to ban CIA recruiting. This was not a frivolous request. CIA misdeeds in Vietnam, notably the Strategic Hamlet program, had been exposed. Vice President Lyman responded in writing that this would be a denial of free speech. By '68-69, most students, many faculty, even members of the trustees and administration no longer believed in the justness or likely success of the war. But the administration was unbending. Neither polite debate with documents demonstrating complicity nor noisy confrontation moved them to consider the wisdom of change. What we saw as the rightful decision of the entire Stanford community, they saw as an attack on their power. This was never clearer than during the winter of 1969. SDS demanded access to the January 14th trustees meeting. Entry was denied and 7 students suspended. 5 trustees, however, agreed to meet with anti-war students, a forum that took place on March 11th in Mem Aude in front of a vocal audience of 1,500, broadcast live on KZSU. The trustees were candid. They would take no responsibility for war research. Students would not participate in their decision-making, nor could they observe. Horrific though the war might be, complicit though campus research was, the Stanford that belonged to the trustees would not change. Ethically repugnant, murderous research, like chemical and biological warfare, was free to continue. We were free to politely protest. Faced with what was the most unpopular war in our nation's history, the trustees and administration told us, in effect, that they would remain on the other side. The forum turned what had been the demands of the relatively small SDS chapter into those of the much broader community. As one SDS leader said, "We started that meeting with maybe a quarter of the audience on our side. We ended with almost everyone." The resulting April 3rd movement was an extremely broad-based coalition of campus groups. The 9-day occupation of the Applied Electronics Lab was both effective and popular. It halted objectionable research, notably the plotting of bombing runs over North Vietnam and along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And it was scrupulously polite and clean. We had focused on proving the unjustness of the war and the criminality of its perpetrators, a battle we won. Most of the campus, indeed most of the country, was against the war. Ultimately, classified research at Stanford was ended. Stanford divested itself of SRI, unfortunately, which allowed war research to continue with no campus oversight. And a student representative would finally serve on the Board of Trustees. The last battle is who writes the history of our part in the broader movement that helped end the war in Vietnam. Thank you.
As probably you know from the introduction, I'm the only one up here who was not a student at Stanford, but I was employed at Stanford Research Institute in 1965 and 66. My educational background before that was completely in Catholic schools, primarily Catholic girls' schools, Catholic girls' college. So I entered the work world a little naive, but certainly having a strong ethical sense, moral sense, and a sense of social justice, although that term wasn't used so much then. It really was the way I was brought up and the type of background I had. I had maybe a naive sense of what my country was about, and when I applied for the proofreading job at SRI in '65, I wasn't sure I would get it because I was a music major and English was not my major, but definitely an interest. But one of the things that was required for this job was to have a background check so that I could get a security clearance. I had never even thought of anything like this. I passed that check, whatever it entailed, because I hadn't done anything yet. I think that was the main reason. And I had a secret security clearance as a result of that check, and then I was hired right after that was cleared. And I was very happy to be working at SRI. I loved the community, the people I met there, the conversations that I had. I thought, this is a fabulous place to work. I'll be here for a long time. I was naive, as I said. What I didn't understand when they put me in the economics department to proofread proposals and projects they were working on, what I would come up against and what I would see. It put me in a tremendous dilemma from the ethical sense that I came there with and what I thought of my country when I started work there, which became very different over the next few years as I saw the complicity of the institution of SRI with the war going on in Vietnam, and also the disconnect of supporting a war that had nothing to do with defending our nation or defending us, but everything to do with looking at supporting profit, corporate profits. And this was something I started learning about through the books I was reading, actually at the Free University, which became a great way to really learn what was going on. And I have to say I got quite an education through the Free University and my association with people here. One area that I was learning about then was the corporate connection between the wars that we had abroad, and certainly this has gone on ever since Vietnam, probably beginning in our era in Korea. So one of the first areas that surprised me were the proposals and projects that I saw being written about, and I wanted to give you a sense of the thinking around SRI at the time. I'd like to just read a couple of quotes from people who were very involved with SRI. One was David Packard, who was a Stanford trustee and later the Undersecretary of Defense. He says, quote, "Profit is the monetary measurement of our contribution to society," unquote. I had been trained to see our contribution to society as service, whether it was monetary or not monetary. So this is a disconnect right there. Another was from Jesse Hobson, who was president of SRI from 1948 to 1955. He says, quote, "This nation occupies 6% of the land area of the world, has 7% of the world's population, produces 50% of the world's goods, and possesses 67% of the world's wealth. Research must be at the heart, the foundation, and the lifeblood of our present defense economy if we are to maintain this position." This position, of course, does not seem at all sustainable and certainly was not desirable by most of the world or Southeast Asia or most of us in this room. So it was another disconnect to look at, do we really want to support a position that puts our country as the dominator of the world. That was another area where questions were coming up. And what I realized after I was working there several months is that I was seeing very sensitive material, much of it unclassified. And it always amused me as to what they would decide to classify and what they wouldn't classify. Because some of the most, I thought, damning information was not classified at all. And other pages would have confidential stamped on it. And you would think, well, why are they classifying this? It doesn't seem that important. So I never understood what they were doing, but I knew if I was going to take any material out of SRI that it couldn't be classified, or I would face a jail term and, I don't know, thousands of dollars in fines, and I thought, I don't really want to do that. One of the things I did want to say from the educational background I had is I wasn't trained to be a rebel. I became that way because of the society and the things that were going on within my country, and I think as many people here had the same experience. So some of the things that I did at that time was to start copying pages of proposals and projects that seemed horrifying to me. And I was just sitting on these pages. I didn't know what I was going to do with them, but I thought someday I'll meet the right person to give them to. I'll tell you about that in a little while. And I did. About a year later, I gave them to Dave Ransom, who was editor of the Peninsula Observer, and he did make use of them, and I was just visiting him and actually have a copy of the article that he wrote as a result of some of this information. We went through all the observers that were in his basement. So some of the activities that SRI was involved in at that time, in which I took some of these pages out, and I will repeat, none of the pages I removed were classified. Just in case we haven't reached that this term limits of this. But some of the activities they were doing at the time were projects for the Naval Warfare Research Center, the Combat Development Experimentation Center, Strategic Studies Center, the Thai U.S. Research and Development Center employing anti-guerrilla strategies, the Pentagon, the CIA, and the government of South Vietnam. Examples of some of these projects were for McDonnell Aircraft, which the project was environmental conditions in selected areas of potential limited warfare. For the Army's Combat Development Command Experimentation Center at Fort Ord, California, it was development and testing of weapons, off-the-road surface vehicles, new aircraft, and theater air transport systems. In 1963, Fort Ord provided SRI's single largest contract. For the Army's Electronic Material Agency, they did mapping, surveillance, reconnaissance systems, and jungle communications, which was directed specifically toward Vietnam. SRI also had 3 teams working in something called Project Agile. This was the Pentagon's worldwide counterinsurgency research program. Ernest Arbuckle, who was then dean of the Stanford Business School and also former chairman of the board at SRI, owned 50% of Thai American Steel Company and was a director of Castle & Cook Incorporated, as well as on the board of several electronics firms in the Stanford industrial parks. So there was definitely, as you can see, very close ties between Stanford faculty, administrators, and Stanford Research Institute. A special mission was sent to South Vietnam, headed by Eugene Staley, who was an SRI senior economist. His recommendations after returning from this trip included increases in military and economic aid to the Diem dictatorship in South Vietnam. And Staley was credited with creating the Strategic Hamlet Plan, although he denies full responsibility for that, but was apparently involved in some way. And as you probably know, that plan moved peasants into new villages that were guarded by the South Vietnamese army. There was also a study for AID, and in this project proposal, senior SRI economist William Brado embarked on an AID project to draw up a land reform program with the agency that would attempt to press upon Saigon. He wrote, quote, "It is considered most important at this time to produce political results that will contribute to winning the war," end quote. and also for the U.S. Army Chemical Corps, which is something that Jeanne brought up too, was research and testing of chemical and biological warfare materials. A proving ground in Utah served as the station for field testing chemical and biological munitions. 2 professors from Stanford's Department of Chemistry worked on these projects, Dr. William Perkins and Dr. Philip Layton. The 3-year contract in 1963 stated that it was for, quote, the investigations of incapacitating type of chemical materials, end quote. These were some of the things I saw when I was working there that was quite horrific. I didn't even know about chemical and biological warfare before I took this job. This is where I learned about it. Many of these projects set off alarm bells, and I did oppose the war from the beginning, but I didn't see my opposition to the war as being a problem with my working at SRI. I still wasn't connecting all that, so I was going to demonstrations when they started. And not long after, when I was speaking to one of the editors of SRI, I got the feeling that there was some kind of work that I wasn't getting, and I wasn't sure why. And I got a lame excuse, and a week or so later I went back and I said, I think you're not telling me something. And it turned out what she wasn't telling me and told me that I couldn't quote her or she would deny it was that I was losing my security clearance. Now at that time, the only thing I had done was maybe gone to 2 demonstrations against the war and joined the Free University. And my feeling that did not, should not in any way affect one's ability to have a security clearance. It was free speech. It was my right to believe what I believed and openly act upon it. This was, I think, a way to learn about how the society really works. You support what the policies are, or you aren't free to really disagree and still work for the government. So I didn't know I was working for the government initially anyway, but that was a shock to me also. And at that point, I decided I can't stay at this institution. I've gotten enough papers out of here, I think, to justify the time I spent there and was able to make use of that. The early stages of the Free University in Palo Alto was, I think, an extraordinary time at Stanford. I think many people in here were involved in that. And as I said earlier, it was a place where graduate students from Stanford and faculty, some faculty members, came together to create classes on things that they weren't being offered here at the university, but were essential for us to understand what was going on in our country at that time and to put the pieces together. How does war relate to the economic needs of a certain class or a certain group of people? These weren't connections that we made before, I don't think. I think they were made during that time. And very few people probably made those connections. Maybe they did in the 30s. I wasn't there. But I know in our generation, this was new, to make all these pieces connect together. And to understand that there was a corporate state that was benefiting and profiting from these kinds of wars. To see profit, as to go back to what David Packard said many years ago, quote, the profit is the monetary measurement of our contribution to society. This was a different way of looking at what we're being educated for. In my mind, our education was to serve the community, to bring community together, to help others, not to exploit them. So this was obviously a different model. I think many of us were seen as rebellious in the 60s and early 70s, and rebellious isn't the word I would use. Rebellious, I think, is something that came as a result of this kinds of information. Do we want to support our country doing this kinds of work, or do we want to help be part of the solution and to change the direction of both the university and our country? So during that time, I had a tremendous camaraderie with the anti-war group here at Stanford, and found that their goals, their ethics, their beliefs, and what they were willing to do for what they believed in was very inspiring. And I still feel that today, and I feel much of what I got here, even though I wasn't officially a student, I did get to audit classes for free because I worked here. and I did. But I feel that much of what became part of my life later, especially starting a peace education institution, came from my work here in the peace movement. And so I have a very strong feeling for Stanford's anti-war movement and peace movement and how it has contributed to all of our lives. And so I thank you, Lenny, for being part of that, and for you, Jeanne, and all of you. Thank you.
In my view, the Stanford movement of the late 60s and early 70s emerged in the form that it did because of the contradictory roles that Stanford played in American and world society. And by movement, I'm not just talking about anti-war. The anti-war movement was connected to the civil rights movement, helped spawn other liberation movements, women's liberation, gay rights. All these things were all part of the same thing, the counterculture too. But Stanford's role was contradictory in that it was training a new group of technical and political, economic and social leaders, and needed to promote free thought, free discussion, free debate to do that. On the other hand, Stanford was one of the leading institutions in the country, great research universities, as Dick Lyman would say, that provided the technologies for the war, the strategies for the empire. And I'm going to talk about this in very personal terms. This is a reprise of a talk I gave to freshman orientation probably around 1971 or 72. It was quite controversial because I believe I was on suspension at the time. I was about 9 years old when the Sputnik went up, the Soviet satellite, and created a great fear throughout the United States that we had fallen behind the commies in the development of modern technology. And so I was one of those kids who was tracked to do the latest and greatest of math and science in middle school and high school. I learned how to program on a Bendix G15, which I showed my kids 20 years ago, I guess, in the Smithsonian. It was a refrigerator-sized computer with the computing power of my watch. That's how I got involved. When I was in high school, I read a Reader's Digest article about Stanford University and how people like Frederick Terman, Hewlett and Packard had created a community of technical scholars here, linking the university and its laboratories with the companies in the Stanford Industrial Park to develop these new technologies in electronics and computing. And I came here because I wanted to be a part of that. Now, I was from a leftist family. My parents were activists in the peace movement, so I was in Student SANE in middle school. That's Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy. My brother went to Mississippi in '64, the civil rights movement. My sister was arrested in the free speech movement in Berkeley in 1965. But I thought I could come to Stanford and be an activist and be part of this community of technical scholars. But what I learned from the research that people like David Ransom did, the information that Georgia gave, that this community of technical scholars was dominated by the military. Stanford had millions and millions of dollars, and Stanford Research Institute even more, developing the technology of warfare. The chances were that if I got my degree at Stanford, that I would end up working in the military-industrial complex. So I lost my enthusiasm as a physics undergraduate for doing the physics, and instead started spending a lot of time in the business school library researching Stanford's connections with the corporations that were part of the military-industrial complex, and in the engineering library researching the contracts that Stanford had and how they were part of the war effort. The Stanford movement may be remembered for some of the more militant actions, the sit-ins, the breaking of windows, but what stands out to me in our history is the research that we did and that we disseminated to the Stanford community. Some of the posters that you see before us are all about that. We would hit people hard with charges. We accused the leaders of Stanford University, the trustees, President Sterling, of being part of the war effort. but then we backed it up with facts. And so I devoted myself, instead of going on in technology, to challenging the control of the technology. I dropped out of science. I became a researcher about science. What's ironic, though, is some of my friends, I can see at least one of them in the room, who stayed with the technology and helped change that technology. That the internet, personal computing, a lot of things that we take for granted as the non-military uses of the advanced technology most advanced technologies known to man and women, came out of the Stanford anti-war movement and counterculture. My friend John Markoff did a book called What the Dormouse Said that goes into that, and some of the people who have written about it say, he didn't quite get it right. Nevertheless, the Stanford movement, the people around it, helped change that technology in a way that I never thought would happen. And so in a sense, the movement was not only a success in ending the war, but in reshaping the technology. We didn't go as far as we would have liked in changing the economic system, the roots of the war, but we were able to bring forward a sense of participatory democracy that many of us are still organizing around through this day. The work I do daily, all over the country, is organizing people to clean up military sites, to clean up other contamination sites through a form of participatory democracy. And one of the big turning points, this March 11th meeting that Jeanne talked about, which one of the students in the audience asked Trustee Bill Hewlett maybe it was, why does FMC make nerve gas? He was on the board of FMC, or whether they did, and he said no, and then he admitted that 6 months ago that FMC had turned that plant over to the government. That was the turning point for the Stanford movement. That was the point at which the students in that auditorium were convinced that SDS had been right, that the research that we'd been disseminating was right. That turning point was also a turning point for Bill Hewlett. I talked to one of his sons many years later, and Bill Hewlett became much more conservative as a result of that day. But we were part of a movement which helped get the United States government out of making chemical and biological weapons. And I was fortunate enough just a few years ago, as a member of a National Academies of Sciences committee, to go to that plant in Newport, Indiana, as part of the supervision of the dismantling of that chemical weapons plant. So I feel, personally, that we were in many ways successful. We didn't do everything we wanted to do, and maybe some of the things we wanted to do were pretty far-fetched. But we did make a difference, and we not only made a difference when we were at Stanford, but we learned how to do those things in a way that we could continue doing them for the rest of our lives. Now, when Dick Lyman gave his talk a little over a year ago, we talked afterwards, and I talked with Jeanne Lyman. They remembered that I did the button "Go Red, Smash State," which was all about, half the people thought was about the Rose Bowl, and half the people thought was about revolution, and was about both. That's what they remembered me for. But as we were finishing our after talk discussion, Dick asked me whether I threw rocks. And I don't think I ever threw a rock through a window at Stanford, but I did throw a tear gas canister into a window at SRI in a demonstration in I guess it was May of 1969. It wasn't my tear gas canister, it was a police tear gas canister, but I did it. But a lot of people think back to the movement and how it became more and more violent, or at least got more and more into property destruction. That's true. And various people kind of got off the boat at different times. Some people did it and are proud of it. Others say, well, maybe I shouldn't have done it. I kind of think that was just a sign of the times. But what Dick didn't recognize when he gave his talk is that the risk management that he was a part of, he was very proud of being able to bring police into Encina Hall to threaten to arrest those of us who were sitting in a nonviolent sit-in. But it was the closing of the nonviolent tactics that led to the trashing. That the big trashing that occurred at the time of the Cambodian, trashing is the word for breaking windows, by the way. The trashing that occurred when Nixon announced that he had not invaded Cambodia occurred because the police were ousting nonviolent sit-in people from the old Union. So the tactics that evolved and the people who became even more violent and waved AK-47s around on their buttons and their newspapers, that grew out of the response that the university, the police, gave the people in the movement who had tried elections, had tried leafleting, had tried sit-ins, and it led to that. Now, everybody here has their own views about whether we were right or wrong. The point is trying to understand historically where this movement came from. We were among the best and brightest of our generation. We were selected to attend Stanford. Many of us have been very successful in our fields since then. But we were hit by this contradiction. We were taught to think, we were taught to do research, and we did it. And we found that the institution that was teaching us that was doing some things that we didn't believe in. And that's what made the Stanford movement so effective and so persistent, and what makes us, many of us who are part of that movement, proud of what we did in the late 60s and early 70s. Thank you. We're going to do question and answer or discussion. If you want to throw mental barbs at us, that's fine. I guess there's some microphones. This is being recorded, so I'd really appreciate if you want to say something to wait till a microphone shows up in your face, and we'll do our best to answer you or just to hear you. I know there are a bunch of people in the audience today who were with us back in the 60s or 70s. Could you give your name and...
Oh yeah, I'm Danny. I'm a current student. One of you, I forget which, mentioned the efforts to expel CIA recruiters from campus. And as you may know, there is a nationwide effort right now, which Stanford seems, or some people in the Stanford community seem to be a part of, to bring ROTC back onto campus. And it seems to parallel recruiting in some sense. So I would be interested in the arguments that you had for opposing CIA recruitment on campus, and what the kind of describe the effort that went into resisting their recruitment.
You want to talk about ROTC?
Well, or CIA or ROTC.
CIA first.
Yeah. CIA first. I think in later years the CIA chose not to come to campuses like Stanford because every time they did, they were met with very, very militant protests, and it never worked out. Nobody ever wanted to go up to the CIA table and, go over to the placement center and be interviewed by the CIA with all your friends watching. So the CIA essentially walked away from many prestigious college campuses, including Stanford. I left campus before the ROTC debate. I know I have my own views about ROTC on campuses and the function of it, but I've been working with anti-war GIs and veterans for many, many years, and most of my friends are very clear that when you have an ROTC presence, whether it's at a high school, junior ROTC, or on a college campus, what you're doing is promoting militarism. And yes, there are good things to say, particularly in high schools that serve economically disadvantaged communities, that kids do get something out of it that they need, but what's the price? And most of my friends who have been in the military say it's not worth the price. so are against bringing ROTC to high school or college campuses. And Lenny was here after I left, so if you want to talk about the ROTC fight and
Yeah, I just want to say that recruiting was an ongoing issue, not just CIA, but Dow, which made napalm. There were a number of people who opposed recruiting by military companies for years on campus. And it was, again, looking at the role of the university as being part of the military-industrial complex and global imperialism. ROTC actually began as an issue in 1969, and it wasn't put forward as much by the militant radical anti-war movement, but by the faculty. And the principal arguments for initially voting ROTC off campus, and they were going to phase it out, so it wasn't gone yet, was that the ROTC wasn't subject to the academic standards of the university. Basically, the military was appointing professors, and they were setting up curriculum, and it wasn't really part of the normal university. As a result of the faculty vote, the trustees and the university administration pushed back, and Stanford withdrew the elimination of ROTC. And that's when the anti-war movement got involved with the ROTC movement. And because of all the things that erupted around the invasion of Cambodia, the pendulum swung back and ROTC was eliminated. But there was a combination of arguments from people like me who just said we shouldn't be part of the war effort, and people who saw ROTC is really not part of the university. Some people recently, we've had a debate on the internet about this, and some people say, well, military science is great. Well, the argument is not whether or not you have military science, it's whether you have military science as taught by the most powerful military organization in the world.
My name is Jeanne Franklin. I was here in '69 and I'm here now. The environment, while we're at 2 unnecessary wars today, is dramatically different from what it was in the 60s. That's been attributed to the lack of a draft. I wonder what your reason might be.
Okay. You want to talk?
Oh, sure. I very much agree. It's due, in my view, to 2 things. One is the lack of a draft. The draft was a very powerful organizing vehicle. People were scared, and the anti-draft movement was a very valid part of the anti-war movement. The second part, though, is that they manage wars better now. They learned a lot from Vietnam. There are no images, you've all read in the newspapers about the Bush policy of not even filming the return of dead servicemen, which was a policy. It was a media policy and a government policy. And President Obama has overturned that, but you don't much see it on the news. You don't see very much on the news. Embedded journalists do not report the way journalists reported in the 60s and 70s. They just didn't. And now there aren't even any of those. So we have, a funny situation where the United States is heavily involved abroad, but the only images we see are very tightly controlled, and a population that is overwhelmingly against Iraq, Afghanistan, all these adventures, and it doesn't matter. It's sort of like we saw, by the early 70s, most of the population in the United States was against the war, but the war went on. So what do you do after you've won in convincing people that this is a bad idea in a democracy? That's a tough question, very political question, and I don't have the answer.
There are 2 things I wanted to address on that. One is that Jeanne brought up that we could see on television at dinner time in the 60s what was going on in the war. I mean, we saw scenes from the war that you don't see now in what's going on in Afghanistan or Iraq. We don't get that kind of coverage, and I think that is one of the lessons they think they've learned. Something that has not changed at all since the 60s and that type of war is the interests, the economic interests that are behind it. And this is the thing that I think that will keep these wars going on until we are able to address it in some effective way. Because underneath these wars, there are always economic interests. And it's one of the reasons why the conference we did last October was on the economics of peace. What would economic systems look like that support peace instead of war? What would have to change? And I think if we're going to take on trying to end wars like this, which are imperialistic wars, we have to look at the economic interests and figure out how to combat this in some way, how to work against them. And I think it's going to take a lot more than demonstrating and a lot of education in the society. When we have the type of TV programs that Fox News puts out that are really manipulating a lot of people's understanding of what's going on in the world, it's horrifying. And at the same time, what is really going on is the corporate interests that are being served by these wars. I think before the first bomb dropped on Iraq, from what I've read, there were probably already contracts signed for the rebuilding of Iraq. So there's Bechtel Corporation, there's Halliburton. These corporations see how they're going to make money before the war even begins. These are the things we really have to come up against. It's the same thing that was going on 40 years ago, and it really needs to be addressed now. I think.
I'm a little more optimistic. It took several years for the movement against the Vietnam War to get any traction. When I first went to demonstrations, we had very little support, either from students or from the general population. We had hundreds of thousands of people, millions around the world, protesting the Iraq War before it started. Once it started, then people didn't know what to do. Now people think it's over because it's not in the news. But it's not, I think a lot of people did learn. Of course, you saw, because a lot of us are older than we were back then, a lot of the demonstrations were led by people in their 50s and 60s and not in their 20s. But I would, I wouldn't say that somehow that there's no anti-war movement today. It's a more difficult problem to deal with politically, but it took years to develop a movement against the Vietnam War. Other questions?
I have a question, actually. Is this on?
No.
No? Not on. There it is. Okay. A parochial, local question back to Stanford, and two parts. One is, in the mid-60s to the early 70s, what kind of collaboration or communication was there between the peace movement at Stanford and the peace movement at Berkeley? And the second part is, I started at Berkeley in '72, but I was in the Bay Area starting in 1970. I had two brothers at Stanford who were very involved politically. And my perception was that in the early 70s, there was more political activity at Stanford than there was at Berkeley. And even a more radical wing of it. My brother didn't get into this, but he had roommates who belonged to Vance Ramos and went out on the weekend and took target practice. The two of them, Rosie and David, have become physicians and upstanding, citizens, and but they expected the revolution to start at any minute, and were preparing for it. And at least it was my perception, being at Berkeley, that there was nothing like that going on in the early 70s. Was that your perception at Stanford? Or
well, I think Berkeley continued, and Berkeley was very sectarian. There were lots of different groups. At Stanford, because we had more of a focus on what Stanford was doing, so there was more on campus. A lot of the groups that became so-called revolutionary groups in the early 70s were telling students to go off and organize elsewhere, that students didn't count. I mean, you've heard of the Weather Underground, and the issue is people always talk about how violent they were because they were blowing up property. Their real weakness, in my view, is that they turned on their base, that they basically turned on the people that they came from and said, you aren't worth it, we're going to go organize other people. But in the 60s, we did have cooperation. There's some posters here from Stop the Draft Week, which is a Bay Area region-wide effort against the Oakland Induction Center. And we did work together, but a lot of the coordination, we didn't have the internet, remember, we hadn't invented it yet. A lot of the coordination was in strange ways. You would read in a newspaper like the New York Times that somebody did something in Madison, Wisconsin against a CIA recruiter, and you see that the CIA recruiter is coming to your campus, so you do the same thing. And yeah, SDS had a newspaper and it had conventions and all that. That's not the way things got around. People saw what worked elsewhere, and they tried to do those things here, and people saw what, and we, of course, at Stanford, we always thought we were the leaders and we would be the model, we'd do something, and people would do the same thing elsewhere. And we would go back, we would send people out to other campuses because we were the Stanford students and we knew better how to organize. And so we tried that, whether whether they appreciate it or not is another question.
Peter Stansky. It just occurred to me, it seems to me there's a curious silence, or one thing that hasn't been mentioned. I mean, how would the panel assess the role of H. Bruce Franklin?
Well, Bruce, well, first, he's a great scholar on Melville. He did very good work in that. He wasn't so good on Stalin. But Bruce was given the blame or credit for things that he didn't do because he symbolized what I would call child stealing. See, Stanford University, unlike San Jose State and maybe even Berkeley, had Rockefellers and Bechtels and McNamara's and Katzenbachs in the student movement. And Bruce was the Pied Piper leading them down the road that their parents didn't want them to go. So there was a lot of pressure on the university to get rid of Bruce. He was fired for events that he really wasn't responsible for. I mean, he was supposedly, they were blaming him for the computer center demonstration, I guess, during the Laos invasion of February 1971. Bruce was there outside the building. He gave a speech at lunch. Bruce's group, I guess it was Venceremos at the time, it could have been the Revolutionary Union, didn't really believe in organizing students. They believed in organizing the lumpen proletariat or maybe campus workers. And they had been pushing to do work among campus workers. And there was another group of us that still wanted to focus on the war and war research. And we discovered graduate student who was at the computer center, because again, we didn't have personal computers back then, discovered a researcher from SRI doing research on amphibious landings at the Stanford Computer Center. He brought us the printout and we analyzed it and said, yes, indeed, he's doing amphibious landings. And the group I was a part of, we were called the Inquisition because we didn't want to be accused of, what's the term, oh boy. Okay, I don't remember. It was a spoof, anyhow. So we called ourselves the Inquisition. And we basically didn't tell Bruce about this program, and we released our own demands to the university because we thought Bruce would want to do something else, which was to have a strike. So he spoke at White Plaza and said, well, there's all this stuff, we ought to have a strike, involve all the workers, but let's begin it at the computer center. Well, it's because everybody wanted to go to the computer center because we'd released this information about SRI doing amphibious landing research at the computer center. So Bruce got blamed, and this was one of the key things he was accused of at his hearing, of causing that demonstration at the computer center. He wasn't the cause, but of course he wanted to be seen as the leader, and so that wasn't part of his defense. So, yeah, I mean, I didn't agree with a lot of the things that Bruce did, but I thought the university singled him out for the wrong reasons, and that's why a lot of us who disagreed with his Stalinism and his gun waving thought he should not have been fired. And the other final thing is, took my kids to the Smithsonian Institution, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. There was an exhibit on Star Trek. It was a great exhibit, talked about how Star Trek was related to women's liberation and civil rights and all that. And, it was really a reflection of the anti-war feelings of the times. Bruce Franklin was a curator of that exhibit. He did a really great job.
Thank you. My name is Steve Kessler. I was one of the off-campus agitators. I wasn't a Stanford student, but I learned a lot from you. And in fact, it was really part of the decisive moments of my life. I was a draft resistor, but I wanted to say before I speak to that specifically, I saw Jeanne Franklin, Bruce's wife, had written an article, and I looked, and I started searching a little bit, and all of a sudden her email popped up, so I wrote her a note. And it's something that I always wanted to engage not just Bruce and Jane, but the broader left here about the mistake that we made. We had an opportunity that we blew. When Henry Cabot Lodge spoke here, by the way, I testified at Bruce's trial, and someone along these lines. I was in the back of the room, and Bruce was in the front, but we were in a straight line between, and Henry Cabot Lodge was on the other side. Bruce didn't do anything. He had his 5 or 6 year old son, who was now a doctor somewhere, I guess. Anyway, in his lap, and Bruce, may have made a wisecrack or something, and that was about it. And there was a few other things, but he got really demonized for that, and so then I was thinking, it took me a while to come up with this, but the criticism was that we, not just Bruce or Vince or Ramos, didn't really do anything. Now, there were liberal professors, pacifists, who were on the board, I don't know, you would know the name of it, to try him or whatever. We could have got them to participate with us to do a citizen's arrest of Henry Cabot Lodge. That's what we should have done. Anyway, I've been very reflective about these moments because I'm seeing the frustrations that people are having on the campuses. I live in Berkeley. The other thing is about the draft. The day of the sit-in was April 10th. I think it was a Wednesday, I'm not sure, or Tuesday. Anyway, that was the day of my draft trial. So it was 2 nights before I saw our SDS and the Resistance had a film series called Up Against the Screen. And we had the movie Battle of Algiers. And I think seeing that film probably, for me, was the only thing that emotionally helped me get through it. Anyway, I had a strange trial. I ended up getting a hung jury with something of a political defense. And, I had decided I'm going to prison. So here I am, it's evening, I'm going to go down and join my friends at the demonstration, at the sit-in. So that's what I did. So it really struck me. But what I wanted to say is what happened to me was, is one of these strange accidents. What the resistance and the anti-draft movement in general did not have a strategy. And that's really, I think, something that we should look back on, because that absence of a strategy meant that we didn't have my mother and other people's mothers and our other supporters in the courtrooms committing civil disobedience until they talk about the constitutionality of the war and the draft as an instrument in carrying out that illegal war. We never challenged them except having the lawyer do that. And so I think that was a big mistake on our part. Anyway, that's enough. Curious what you folks have to say about that.
Okay. The Stanford Movement did have a strategy. In fact, in the summer of '69, after the April 3rd movement, a right-wing investigative reporter from the San Francisco Examiner published what they called a top echelon SDS leaders, which plotted out what we would do that year, from the breaking into the trustees meeting, the forum, the sit-ins, the street demonstrations, and it was all a plot. And in fact, I was one of the people who wrote that memo, and it was never adopted, but it happened anyhow. And that was more how the movement happened. We didn't have people telling us what to do from above, but we did have a sense of what would move students, and we were quite successful. Now, the Lodge demonstration does bring up an important debate that we had, and I think a lot of people have mixed feelings looking back, and that is, what's free speech? Does the CIA have a right to free speech? Does somebody who's a war criminal have free speech when they've got access to the... Are we denying them free speech when they come, we shout them down on campus, when they have access to all the media in the world that they want? And I see both sides of the argument. And this is one of the dilemmas from a movement that started as the free speech movement in Berkeley, And we were shouting down people who were engaging in the war. And that was, for a lot of people, a difficult decision. When is speech really free? Is there really a marketplace of ideas? Or is that marketplace shaped by investments in the university and control of the national media?
I think the lack of debate, when we were not allowed to be part of a debate, but had to just be in the audience, there wasn't any choice of engaging in conversation or debate. And I think that frustration caused a lot of the reaction to people like Lodge. I was thinking while Lenny was talking, this isn't strategy, but it's certainly analysis that was part of the movement at the time, was the Port Huron statement that came out of the founding of SDS that Tom Hayden primarily wrote. But that is still really valuable today, and it was republished, I think, a few years ago with an update that Tom Hayden did. And that analysis of the part I was talking about before, of the economic interests, of what society is about that supports wars of exploitation, imperialist wars, I think that's one of the best analyses that is still accurate today, 40, almost 50 years later. It was written in 1961, I think.
Time for one last question, maybe?
I just wanted to say that, Georgia, your story about how you started coming across these documents and that you didn't know what to do, but you copied them and saved them and waited for an opportunity to come along, that in today's age, as a lot of us, you can find things on the internet or you stumble across things. I think that story was really impressive to me. And I don't know what my question is, but I guess my question is that I hope you tell that story a lot and that a lot of people know about that. And that's really neat.
I was
and
afraid to tell
kudos to you, really.
For many years, I was afraid to tell that story. So what are the statutes of limitations, even though, it wasn't classified?
It's passed.
It's passed.
Unless you murdered somebody.
No, I didn't. But it was something I didn't talk about for a long time. And I know Dave Ransom had told me back then, after he published some of this material, that, and he was talking to people at SRI, following up on some of the things that I gave him, one person asked him, how did you find out we were working on this? How did you know this? And of course, he wouldn't divulge that. And with the internet now, you can find things really quickly. So it's a different game now. But thank you. It was kind of exciting, I have to say.
So, how about if we just the three of us make some final comments?
Sure.
You go first.
It was your idea.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank the Stanford Historical Society for letting us have what I do view as our turn. Because I was at the Lyman talk, and I do view this as a chance to, I don't know if I feel like it's setting the record a little straighter, but really saying from a point of view, it's hard to remember, and I see one of the wonderful, I'm sure there's more than one here, one of the current Stanford students who are still out there. Mm-hmm. This is a tough place, There's a lot of smart people on this campus, and they can out-talk each other pretty well. And so I want to say that we were talking to people who were smart people, and many of whom were against the war. They saw the university differently than we did, and in the end, I think we were right. I was kind of dreamily thinking last night, what could have happened differently? What if the Stanford trustees and administration had said, what could we do within the bounds of our legal obligations to the university that would make a difference in the war? What if any institution in the United States had said that? My God, what if they said it now? And so I had a little bit of what I hear when Georgia talks about peace institutes and changing the way we are. So thank you very much for letting us do that.
Go ahead, Carl. Just squeeze in one question.
Sure.
Well, it's a criticism about the people here that I agree with.
You have to hold this closer.
Because I keep hearing about the wealth that is available, and then people have big wealth, they do bad things. But I don't see why that has to be the case. It's possible that a lot of these people who are wealthy or head of Stanford or SRI, they have political ideas, don't necessarily depend upon what their wealth is. It is in a certain way. I mean, if they're people that are going to use their power in hurting other people in a way connected to their wealth, sure, I'm all in favor of that. But suddenly I've been hearing about all the wealth of these people, and their decisions are made on the basis of their wealth, and I'm wondering whether that's the only way in which you can say they're doing the wrong things. I mean, we have George Soros, for example, making millions of dollars on his hedge funds, but George Soros can also be a very liberal person, and I think it's not thinking about why people do what they do simply because of their wealth, unless you can see that the wealth itself is what you're in favor of or against. That's the question.
Okay. Do you want to?
Yeah, I do.
The answer to that into one of your closing
Yeah.
remarks?
I don't think, I know I mentioned names because I wanted to make it more clear that this really happened, but I don't think it's a personal attack of people of wealth. I think it's looking at the system that creates certain power structures in society. And this is a little bit of a sidetrack, I'll only spend a minute on it, but having spent a week, well, actually 2 weeks in Mondragon, Spain a year and a half ago, and I'm going back again this fall, and seeing how worker-owned businesses operate, both on a democratic standpoint, what the division of wealth is in the community, where there's no poverty and there's no wealth. So there aren't rich people, there aren't poor people, everyone is a very comfortable middle class. And after I was there for a little while, I realized this is really what we're talking about, this kind of society. Because the society that we live in that has all these different levels of economic well-being and not well-being is one that does promote the things we say we don't believe in, which is war. Things that require exploitation of other societies, of people, of resources. But when you're living equally or in a more equitable society, you don't need to do that. So I don't think this is a personal attack. It's looking at the system in which we support and how can we better the system so that it really does support peace, social justice, environmental sustainability, all the things we say we believe in and do believe in. I think that's what I would be looking at. We need a more equitable type of society and social structure. So in my closing remark, that is something I would have wanted to have said anyway. After being around here for several years and then being a professional musician for many, many years, when I started Praxis Peace Institute, I realized, well, I've definitely agitated against war and done a lot of work in that area, but I don't know a lot about making peace. What is that about? So just as I was thinking about that, I had moved to Sonoma, and in the mailbox comes this catalog from Sonoma State University offering a 2-year program in conflict resolution. I thought, aha, I'm signing up right now. I'm not even thinking about it. And what I found from that course, because I did take the whole course, was that you do start thinking differently when you start working in ways that resolve conflict. Doesn't mean you don't have boundaries and you don't have limitations and they're not things you say no to. That's part of learning conflict resolution too, is you don't let people walk all over you. You do have a spine, but you know how to negotiate and how to bring out points in a way that doesn't aggravate people unnecessarily, although there's a time for that too. So I think learning about peace building and learning about what are the processes of creating peace, what does the social environment need to look like and the economic environment, these are the questions I've had for many years and will continue to have. I think a lot of that began here, and I'm grateful for that. And grateful for having the opportunity to do what I have and to have learned from places like Mondragon, which now to me is a model of the kind of society that supports peace. Thank you.
I want to conclude by just saying a couple of unique things about the Stanford movement that I've been thinking about as we've been talking about it. People might not remember or know of. The first is when we did sit-ins at Stanford, we didn't lock. There was one counterexample, but generally we didn't lock the doors shut. We locked them open, and we used them as a basis to go out and hand out leaflets all over campus. People would get up early in the morning. We'd print out leaflets. Matter of fact, during the AEL sit-in in the spring of '69, we took over a print shop that was part of the engineering school, although it had been used to print some anti-sex education pamphlets for somebody over there. But we took it over. We printed probably 750,000 sheets of paper there, newsletters, flyers, booklets. We even paid people to come in and repair the printing presses. And we would hand these flyers out all over campus. We used the sit-in as a base from which to organize the campus rather than an end in itself. During the Old Union sit-in in '68 and the AEL sit-in, we had faculty tea parties. Students dressed up and served tea to the faculty so we could talk about why we were there. It wasn't simply a matter of force to some degree. The force we exerted was a way to engage the debate in a way that we couldn't otherwise do. So that was a fairly unique Stanford thing. I don't know of other campuses that use that approach, but the other thing that was unique, during Cambodia, the Cambodian invasion, student strikes all over the country, students were shot at Jackson State and Kent State. We never had to worry about that at Stanford. The San Jose police were told not to use their guns, even though students were throwing rocks at them. They could use tear gas, but they weren't, because they could have ended up shooting the sons and daughters of the people in power in this country. So in some ways, we got away with things at Stanford that others couldn't get away with because of who some of us were. Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'll be around for a few minutes if you want to hear some more stories. That's the problem with this kind of thing, is that you're always reminded of things that are worth recounting, but you've only got a limited amount of time. But again, I appreciate you coming. I think, yeah.
I just want to thank you for your activism and your commitment from way back then until now. Thank you.
Well, thank you.